Okay guys, let's keep going on the skeletal system, and now we're going to move on to the trunk of the body. Okay, so just like the trunk on the tree, the trunk of the body is going to be the part that holds us up in the middle, and in that case it's going to be our vertebral column. The vertebral column is broken up into a couple different sections based on two things. One, location, where it's actually found, and two, the function that it's going to serve when it's in that particular location. So we're going to look at first the cervical vertebrae, which are the first 7, and we call those C1 to C7. These will include C1, which is called the atlas, and C2, which is the axis. Now, the atlas is the vertebrae that's going to hold all the weight of the cranium and the head, everything that's inside the head. And the axis is going to be the point where the head can pivot. So the atlas will pivot on the axis. So they're two really important vertebrae, so they're given their own names. The rest of them we just kind of designate a number and letter system. The next group we'll look at are the thoracic vertebrae, and there's going to be 12 thoracic vertebrae, T1 down to T12. These are going to be fairly large vertebrae. There's going to have a large spinous process that sticks off the posterior part and heads downwards. These vertebrae are going to be important because they're going to be the attachment point for the ribs. As we keep going inferior, we'll get down to the lumbar vertebrae, and there's going to be 5 lumbar vertebrae, L1 to L5. These are going to be the longest, the largest vertebrae. They're going to be the bulkiest of the whole group, and they generally have shorter processes, so shorter extensions sticking off from the bone. Okay, after we get through with the lumbar vertebrae, now we're into the actual pelvic bone, and the back part, the posterior part of the pelvic bone, is going to be made up of what we call the sacral vertebrae. Now, this is going to be one solid piece of bone. It's going to be from 5 separate vertebrae that fused from when we were children, when we were developing. So that's going to make 5 fused bones, and that's going to be the sacral vertebrae. And right below that we get to the coccygeal vertebrae, which makes up our coccyx, which is the tailbone. And that would have come from, when we were children, it would have been 4 or 5 vertebrae that are fused together. So if we have a picture, we look over here, we can see the cervical vertebrae, and we're going to have 7 of those. The first one's the atlas, the second one is the axis. Then next we move down to the thoracic vertebrae, and you're going to see that's in the chest. Those are going to be the ones that are responsible for connecting the ribs. There's 12 thoracic vertebrae. Then we move down into the lumbar region, where we're going to see 5. These are the biggest vertebrae, and they're also going to have the smaller projections. And then we get down into the sacrum, where again there's 5 vertebrae, but they're fused. Okay, so they're only going to be represented as just one single bone, but they're from 5 bones that have fused together. And then finally we get down to the coccyx, and that's going to be where we have either 4 or 5 vertebrae that were separate as children, but as we moved into adults, they fused together. Now, this is having a look at the atlas and the axis. So this is going to be C1 here, C1, and then the axis down here is going to be C2. And this is basically just showing the position and the fact that we are looking at some foramen, and these are going to be common in all of the vertebrae, of course, because the spinal cord has to travel down through the vertebrae. Alright, so these are just having a quick look at the special cervical vertebrae. This slide here, I don't expect you guys to remember everything that's on this slide, but I just want to point out a few things. First of all is this vertebral foramen. Okay, that's going to be the hole in the inside part, or the middle of the vertebrae, where the central nervous system, the spinal cord, is going to live. And you can see that's common in each one of the vertebrae. Now, what I do want you to just remember, to be cognizant of, is the body of the vertebrae. That's the main one. main part of the vertebrae, that's what's going to connect with the next vertebrae below or above. And then we're going to have these spinous processes. The spinous process is the one that's going to extend dorsally, so that's going to be the one you could feel if you rub your finger down somebody's back. And then the transverse processes are the ones that are going to stick out laterally to the sides. And these transverse processes will change shape depending on what region of the vertebrae we're looking at. So the vertebrae look different if you take them from the cervical region, the thoracic region, or the lumbar region, and that's because of the different function that they have given their position on the body. So the next part of the axial skeleton is going to consist of the thorax. Now the thorax are the bones that are immediately surrounding the cardiovascular system, so the lungs and the heart. So that's going to be make up 24 ribs, so 12 pairs of ribs, and the sternum bone, which is often called the breastbone. Okay, so if we have a quick look at the ribs first of all. The first 7 pairs of ribs are called true ribs, and they're called true ribs because they're directly connected to the sternum by the costal cartilage. And the costal, when you see that word costal, it refers to the ribs. Okay, so you'll see costal, you'll see intercostal space. It's always talking about the ribs. So there's 12 pairs of ribs, so the first 7 are true ribs. The next remaining 5 pairs are false ribs. So the immediate 3 pairs after the first 7, so pairs 8, 9, and 10, they're considered false ribs because they attach to the cartilage. They don't directly attach to the sternum, and we'll see a picture of that in a couple of seconds. And then the last 2 remaining pairs of ribs, they're called floating ribs. They don't actually have any connection to the sternum or the costal cartilage at all. They just basically float out there and add a little bit of extra protection. So those are the ribs, and the second bone that we're talking about in the thorax is the sternum. Now the sternum is a long flat bone. It's shaped like a T. It has the anterior part is the T-shaped, what we call manubrium, and the manubrium is the articulating surface, or the place of the bone that's going to join with the clavicles, which are part of the pectoral girdle. The body of the sternum is where we have ribs 2 to 7 join. At the very posterior or inferior part of the sternum is a cartilaginous extension called the xiphoid process, and you probably commonly heard that called the solar plexus. So it's almost dead center of your chest. So here's a look at what we've just been talking about. So T1 down to 7, these are going to be our true ribs because they're connected through the intercostal cartilage to the sternum. So here's our sternum here, large flat bone, and then this up here is the manubrium, which will connect to the scapula. So those are our true ribs. Our false ribs are going to be down here, pairs 8 to 10, and they're considered false ribs because they don't attach directly to the sternum. They only attach to the cartilage that then attaches to the sternum. And then finally down here you'll see pairs 11 and 12, and those are the floating ribs. They don't have any connection at all to the sternum. So that's a look at the thorax. And that brings us to the end of the appendicular skeleton. In the next video we're going to go and talk about the appendicular skeleton.